I'm Kimberly Dark, and welcome to the Hope Desk. And some of you know me already. I'm a writer and sociologist and storyteller, and I have simple answers for you about questions regarding social inequity. If you have your own extra questions that you would like me to handle another time, or a topic that you would like to talk about, you can put it in the chat box. You can also email info@KimberlyDark. And you know what? Just as a reminder, I don't have all the answers. I don't even have the only right answers about these things, but I'm going to spend up to an hour each week doing what I can to address some of these topics that people struggle with, because I think it is hopeful when more people feel like they know enough to join public conversations. And that's what I'm hoping that we're able to do as a result of this sort of a thing. So yes, today we are talking about how does the gender pay gap come to be? And since we're on the topic of pay, I figured we would also address, which is a smaller topic, resume inequity, resume bias. And I'll talk about that with regard to race, gender, and social class, which is one that we don't talk about very often. I'm also not here to offer you in-depth scholarship about any of these topics. In most cases, other people are more qualified to do that than I am, but I will sometimes offer you some easy to access resources. But look, you know, sociologists have a perspective on the architecture of everyday life that can be helpful. So I'm just here to do my small part. And so let's talk about gender inequity in the pay gap in particular. So you all know this data. Like, I feel like everyone knows this thing about 77 cents on the dollar, right? And the number fluctuates just slightly, but not by a whole lot. And that's all women put together. 77 cents on the dollar women earn for a man's dollar. It's even worse, of course, when we're talking about women of color. But here's what I find is that very few people actually know, how does that come to be? Because of course, you know, when two people walk into the Walmart, a man and a woman, and they ask for a job application, nobody is saying you get less and you get more. They're both starting at the same amount. And yet this gap persists. And so we're going to talk about that. So I want to just first say something, much as I commented last week about how a lot of our issues regarding racial inequality in the United States stem from the fact that Black people in specific and people of color in generally were treated as not human. And because we have a really complex way that we make sense of the social world, we don't just stop having those feelings just because a law changes. And especially since we live in a nation that has never yet taken responsibility for treating certain people as subhuman, you can't climb out from that quite so easily. Hey, the same is true with gender. The same is true with gender. So when we talk about women having been chattel, not too long ago, literally property, we're not climbing out of that real fast, in part because we have not acknowledged that that's true. So does that mean women as chattel, the same thing as chattel slavery? No, it doesn't, because women have been seen as a tool for creating family solidarity. Right? So you'll know how this has worked historically, probably in other countries, with arranged marriage. We talk about it with the royals quite a bit in various countries. But really, marriage has only been a romantic situation for a very short period of time. It's often been, and I would argue still is, about how do we put certain privileges and opportunities together. And most of us are not conscious of that when we fall in love. But, you know, let's face it, you're not as likely to fall in love with someone who happens to be homeless if you live in a house. I mean, things like this. We do still have social barriers that we observe. So this is the role that women as chattel have played, as that, you know, men largely are maneuvering how to bind families together to create power relationships. Okay, the reason I'm saying this is that this is what undergirds all of the current kind of sexism that we have today, and the wage gap is part of that. So check it out. After the Industrial Revolution, there became the labor that happens at home and the labor that happens outside of the home. And mostly women took the labor that happens inside of the home. And there became a devaluation on anything related to that kind of labor. So I'm going to actually share screen here, and I'm going to show you a few slides in order to more quickly talk through some of the history of this. So here's the thing that I would like you to just think about for a moment. This little comic where he says, sure, I make $3 million a year, but what people don't realize is the hard work and long hours I put in. This is the briefcase. And then the scrubber woman who is over there scrubbing the floor, she says, gosh, I only work 3 jobs on my hands and knees for 11 grand a year. He must work really, really hard. So I want to just show you this slide first because it's a good thing to ask. Do we need people who scrub the floor? Do we need people who take care of small children? Do we need people who take care of the elderly? These are traditionally female-dominated jobs that have been culturally devalued. Because here's the issue with, let's see, can I do this? Can I do this? So these are the stats that we already know, right? That the gender pay gap hasn't budged in more than a decade. And it's significant to say 2010 was the first year that women outnumbered men on the nation's payrolls, because a lot of people still have this idea that women are not as often breadwinners, right? That they don't work as often, and that is simply untrue. Of course, it's always been not true for poorer women. So here's how we're looking at women and men and educational attainment, right? And those numbers look like much like what you know. Yes, but you can see that it varies a little bit. And please do, if you need to ask a question, write it in the chat box and Emily will alert us, because you know I can't see anything over here. Okay. This is another way to look at this data, is with regard to race. That, you know, men make more than women regardless of what race, but check out how those things line up. So Latina women are obviously making less than half what Asian men are making, and that's a trip, right? So these are interesting, this is interesting data to look at, broken out by race. Okay, now we're getting where I thought I was, which is historical circumstances affecting women's pay. So do you all know that, wow, historically, women and men do different kinds of labor. And that this is still more true than not true in our nation. So women constitute 99% of secretaries, 93% of registered nurses. I mean, these are things that you could maybe know that women dominate, but that much? Did you know it was that much? And so these become whole fields that are devalued. Now, you might say to yourself, wow, registered nurse, actually, that's a really good job. Unions. So there are certain places in this kind of data where union organizing has helped a certain profession rise. And, you know, we can talk about unions a different week if you want to, but that's part of what we're looking at here. That thing about K-12 school teachers is really interesting because, you know, it started out that, I mean, explicitly so, that women taught children because states could pay them less. About a third at the time. You know, Massachusetts was the first state that had compulsory schooling. But so these are significant. And here's the other side of that, right? Some other kinds of jobs. All right. Now let's look at some average weekly salaries of the most female jobs and the most male jobs. This is a big place that the gender pay gap resides, is in simply having segregated workplaces, right? So if you look at those male jobs, you'll see that minor, unless they're unionized, is a really low paying job. Actually, so is airline pilot. A lot of people don't know that, but that's not a super high paying job either. Some of those others are, though. And some of the kind of segregation that happens in fields like tech and law are really significant as well with regard to how, and medicine is another one, right? Female doctors are still far more likely to be pediatricians than any other specialty. So this is where a lot of that pay gap resides. And I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment so we can talk about the next place that the pay gap happens. So yes, there has been activism to, try and go, hey, we should gender integrate these fields. But it's slow going, right? I have a new book coming out next year. And then in the introduction, I talk about the firefighter example, for instance, right? That is still about 3% of US firefighters are women. And so when you start talking to a city about, okay, so if you're gonna have men and women on the force, there has to be, for instance, restrooms and changing facilities for both genders, it starts to feel like that's a really weird expense to have to bear for just like 2 or 3 women on the force. And so it starts to make people cranky to even talk about recruiting into professions that have long been held by men. By the way, there are a few examples of professions that used to be dominated by women and are now dominated by men and went up in status as a result. That happens. And then, the other way, of course, happens as well. Professions that used to be dominated by men and then went down. So here's the thing, though, that I really want to talk about, which regards how the pay gap occurs within professions, right? So segregation of the workforce is one thing, but then within a profession, there are also additional problems. And think for just a moment about the sorts of plates in the air that all of us have, right? Like each one of us, we have personal interests that we juggle. We have career, we have keeping the house clean, we have relationships with, like, let's say your parents or your children, or your relationship with adult children. You have relationships, family relationships to maintain, and you have cleaning the house. Did I get all of them? I think so. Career and income, child raising, housework. So each of us has all of those plates in the air. So think about for a moment you managing all of those things. And now I'm trying to see, everyone on this call appears to be female. Let's say for just a moment, you are female and you are married to a man, and he has all of those same plates in the air. When a couple gets together, we still have a situation of unequal labor, and that is going to affect the gender pay gap eventually. So check it out. You've got your plates in the air for, personal interests. He's got his personal interests. That's great. And then there's housework. That takes a certain amount of time, but wait a minute. Housework duties are still largely accomplished by women if a man and a woman live together. And so actually, she's holding his plate as well for that, right? She is handling that for him. Ditto with childcare responsibilities. So even though we have come a long way, and right, if you're a person who is under 40 and you know your father is a real human being rather than a specter behind a newspaper, thank the women's movement, first of all, but also understand that, yes, there have been gains that take place, but what that means is that women are still taking care of about 70% of childcare responsibilities. Because folks, there's a big difference between taking the child to the park one day and doing the child's laundry and housekeeping every day. So these are still the persistent tasks, are the ones that women generally take care of. This is also true with housekeeping, right? That like you might clean the gutters on the house once or twice a year. Men are more likely to do that kind of labor, but things like cooking and laundry, women are more likely to do daily labor. So she's carrying his responsibility for childcare and for housework. Now, sure, you could say, I know these people where it's different than that. But I want to just tell you about one of my favorite studies regarding this is that, so social scientists talked to couples who said, yes, we 100%, we absolutely split housework down the middle. We absolutely do that. And so those researchers gave them some logs to fill out, right? Like how much time are you actually spending scrubbing the floor or doing the windows or doing whatever the thing is. And you know what? These are in couples where both of them said 50-50, absolutely. What do you suppose they found? Men are doing 30% of housework in those households. So you can only imagine in couples where their perception is, no, it's really different, that far less is being done. Okay. One more. Parental caregiving and family connectivity. So here's the question I always ask. If somebody is going to organize a Thanksgiving dinner in your house and see who to invite and the family, how are they going to get there and where they're going to stay, who's likely to do that, your mother or your father? I already know the answer to this question, so you don't actually have to answer. Or if somebody in your household is going to send Christmas cards to everybody, who's that likely to be, your mother or your father? Or if somebody gets falls down some stairs and ends up in the hospital and somebody needs to take a casserole over to the kids at the house, who's that likely to be, your mother or your father? And here's the deal. It's not like she's just doing that for her family. She's doing that for her in-laws as well. So she also has his burden for this. So what ends up happening here is that men in relationships with women really are only taking full responsibility for two areas of their life's functioning: career and personal interests. And employers know this. This is how we're coming back to the wage gap. So there are so many things that we know, but we don't say we know. We know, but we don't know, right? And this is part of why I'm interested in having these conversations, is because, wow, I think we ought to get more conscious about the stuff that we actually know. So let's just take, for example, two lawyers. They get out of law school as a man and a woman. They get out of law school, they go to work. They might be earning the same amount of money, or there might be outright sexism already at play, and the man might be hired at a little more than the woman. Because outright sexism, where somebody consciously thinks, I think this guy is going to be worth more in the workplace than this woman, that is still totally at play, totally possible. But I'm mostly talking about the subtler stuff. So off they go, they're making very similar wages. But there's a perception that that woman has maybe an interest in having children. She's married, and so she has familial responsibilities. And so maybe as a big case comes up, the person in charge decides that she's going to do more of the background research, but he's actually going to court because we can control his schedule more than we can control hers. This may not even be true. It may be that she has chosen to devote 100% of her time to her career, but the perception is still there. And then maybe, the next big case comes along and there's a whole lot of stuff to be done at the front end of that. And she's got to pick up her kids at school if they're sick. And so the perception is she doesn't have time to put in. And so he gets another big case that is, causes him to have to do some extra learning and causes him to be in a position where, he's putting in extra time at work. The thing is, she is not getting time off because she has to go pick up her child at school. She is simply not being given the opportunity to do the additional work of learning the new thing, trying the new case, being in court doing the thing. Not as often, at least. And she will have to fight for those moments when she is given that opportunity. Okay, 10 years on, they are now ready, those two individuals, to go and apply to a different law firm, and they put together their resumes, and you know what's happened? He literally does have more experience than she does. He literally has had a broader range of workplace experiences, even though she has not worked a minute less than he has for that firm. She has not had as much ability to choose how much she has done. And when they both go to that interview, 10 years into their careers, sexual bias is still at work. So chances are she is still seen as not as valuable simply by being female. But also, his resume is better than hers. He has done more and he's going to be paid more. So this is why, folks, when we look at a graph that shows the gender wage gap for individuals and how that grows over time, it widens over time as well. So I picked an example of, really educated people, right? People who are lawyers and are going to go and do that kind of work. But we could be talking through the same kind of stuff with, let's say, food servers. So when you go to fancy pants restaurants, you're more likely to be served by men. And we all know that in the US at least, server pay is connected to the price of the meal because the main money that servers are making is tips. So automatically men are making more than women. The majority of restaurants, Denny's notwithstanding, because they hire male and female servers regularly, but the majority of really low-end restaurants where people can work 50 hours a week and still have to live in their car, those are going to be women. No? You could talk about the same thing. I don't even know if there's Sears. Sears still exists as a big department store in rural places. I don't know about everywhere, but on commission, where are men most likely to work in Sears? They're most likely to be selling the riding lawnmower and the tools and the appliances, higher commissions than the women who are selling cosmetics and clothing. So we can trace this phenomenon through a number of different professions that are theoretically gender integrated. It's so depressing, right? I'm so sorry. But does anybody have questions about anything that I have said so far? Or comments or things that you would like to address about the gender pay gap?
So I have heard that women, particularly mothers, have a management, there's a mental management around home, and that burden is also disproportional. So the organizational or the management of these plates, who's where, all of those kinds of things, and that is in addition to their actual physical tasks. So
yes.
I'm not exactly sure where I read that, but it showed that.
But I think that's absolutely true. And this is the thing where, okay, the child is sick at school and somebody has to go pick up the child. Who prioritizes that? So here's an additional thing that goes along with what Migra is saying, is that let's say that woman says, no, I can't go. I can't go away from work today and pick up the child at school. She says to her male partner, you got to go. Like, that's, sorry, you got to go. Let's say she does that. It's totally possible. It's also totally possible that she says, no, I'm not cleaning this house. I worked all day and I'm coming home. And no, it's not happening. But then here's the question. If his parents come over to the house, let's say his parents and her parents, let's say all four of them come over to the house and it's messy, which one of them gets blamed? See, this is the thing. If somebody's talking about children and a man says, my wife couldn't go pick up the kid at school, which one of them is going to get evil social shade for that? Right? So there is good damn reason that women prioritize these tasks, is because otherwise they are carrying the additional burden of social stigma for being a bad mother, or for being a bad housekeeper, or for being a bad wife, right? So there are good reasons that that employers will assume that a woman is going to prioritize her family ahead of the job. And chances are it will be true. I think it's tricky though, because even if it's not true, she is still being treated as though it is, right? So a woman can decide, no, I'm 100% career and personal interests. In fact, I'm not even getting married. Just by being female, she's going to be perceived as having other things to do. What else you got? Anything you want to talk about regarding the gender pay gap?
So I would be interested, so can I offer a backstory?
Yes.
So the backstory is, just kind of looking at how we add this into race and inequality, and how do we understand it as the layered kind of stigmas and those kinds of things. Because I think that, my understanding is incomplete, but it's easy to, so anyways, the understanding that I have is that what happens is that you could have a company. So this is a scenario. So you have a company, and the company is very committed to equality, and they do a pay assessment, and they find out that there's inequality, and they change everyone's pay so it's all equal. And the company feels really good, fast forward. And they get wind, one of the employees complains and says, hey, I'm not getting paid as much as Bob. And the company goes, geez, we did all this work. We equalized the pay gap. I don't understand what's going on. But in between point A and point B, people got hired, people got fired, companies were acquired, and all of the previous systems come into the stream. And when they come back into the stream, all of the bias and the decision-making around those systems is then incorporated within not only the culture, but also the decision-making structure. So the point that was kind of brought forward is that getting pay equality is not a one and done. It's a process. And that the process is, absolutely at the highest level, turning around and saying, like, do I have systems in place to ensure that I'm providing, equal pay? But it's also at the management level, is to turn around and say, like, hey, as a manager, I'm looking at an influx of workers or a change in policy or, whatever. Am I upholding this? And the, scenario or the kind of situation that was discussed, and I can't recall the details because I don't recall details great anymore, was just, again, it was just kind of coming out, was that this CEO was just really, upset. I don't know, it was like Patagonia or something, but, he was really upset that it didn't work, and that it took a lot of vigilance. And he was like, we have this at the corporate level, at the highest level, like, I want this to happen. But that even that top-down approach wasn't enough. It really had to be the groundswell bottom up as well. It had to come from both directions. That was kind of the summary. Go ahead.
Thanks for that story, because it has to come from all directions persistently for a very long time. That's what I would say. And yes, it is irritating when a company realizes that things will snap back to the previous normal if they don't continue with some vigilance there. There are some things that can help, and pay transparency is one of them. If people are, if people, like in public, like with public employees, where people can know what the salary is for a certain job, that can be helpful. But also if people are free to talk about how they came to get a certain amount of pay, and that they understand themselves why they were offered a certain amount of pay for a certain job, that can also be helpful. But absolutely, we will continue to snap back into patterns that seem comfortable, because we have to keep dealing with unconscious bias all along. Because remember, sexism is part of it, overt sexism, but then the other part of it is what feels normal. Lizzie, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I wondered if you could talk about like negotiation skills, and like how some women either don't know how, or are afraid, or don't feel like they have a right to negotiate for higher pay, whereas a man might automatically just say, yeah.
So this is a thing that I can talk more about, which is that what you just said, that women don't feel as entitled to request more pay, and they are also not as well received when they do. So I am no expert on how a person can ask for more pay. There is actually some great online courses, and you're posting an event. I was going to suggest events through AAUW, American Association for University Women, has some good events, but that looks like another great one to
this is put on by a woman in San Diego named Skylar McCurran, whose whole goal is to advocate for equal pay.
Beautiful.
For women.
Beautiful.
And she has an event on Thursday.
So check that out for sure. But also understand that getting yourself ready to ask is only one part of the equation, that women are still not well received when making direct requests. And, we need to handle that from all angles. I haven't worked for somebody since the 90s, so it feels a little hard for me to comment, but I'll tell you, my approach would probably be to hand my boss some research on how women are not well received when they ask for things, and say, look, I understand this isn't you, but I just want to say this is how this usually goes, but I am, entitled to make these requests. So yes, you can seek out events like this and learn some more skills, but also don't take it personally if it doesn't work every time, because the person with the catcher's mitt is also part of the communication dyad. Hey, can I move on and talk about resumes, because it's related? So here's the thing. You may have heard about this research before, where 2 resumes go out in the mail to the same company for the same job, and they are identical resumes, except for the name at the top. So one of them might be John Smith, and the other one might be LaVon Jackson. And those 2 resumes are identical in every other way. And John Smith is more likely to get the job interview by a lot, yeah? The same research has been done with, Mary Johnson, and give me a nice Black woman's name, put it up at the top of the resume, and the same will be true there. So this is like this kind of research in the social sciences, oh my God, it's low-hanging fruit, right? It's like, we didn't even have to do much to send this stuff out and, you know, get this information that is clear, incontrovertible evidence of racism. So this study has been replicated 12 ways till Sunday, which is wonderful, because apparently as human culture, we need a whole lot of evidence before we do jack. So it is wonderful that this same research has been replicated with Latinx names versus white sounding names. It has also been replicated in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, kinds of mathematics fields, with male and female names at the top of the resume. What do you bet happens? Men are way more likely to get the interview. So this kind of racism and sexism, because remember, same job, identical resumes, right? It still happens. And because this kind of research is such low-hanging fruit, right? Like this kind of study has been done over and over and over again with different groups, but also across time. Nothing is budging, folks. Nothing is budging. So I mentioned to you the thing about social class as well. So here's the deal. What do we do about this? A lot of HR folks have tried to figure out, oh my God, have you seen the research? We don't want to do that. We don't want to discriminate. And so what about blind resume review? Because here's another thing. People will also look at the address on a resume to decide, where does this person live? Now, some of that still has to do with race, not gender, of course, because men and women live together sometimes, but race. So it could be that a resume is racialized by the address, but it also comes to pass that a resume is revealed in terms of class status based on where that person lives. And have y'all noticed that we live in a culture that loves and idolizes wealth, even though, you know, there's no good reason to do that, right? Usually wealth is an indicator of family lineage, not an indicator of anything else, superior education or intelligence or anything. So blind resume review works. Like, it works. You take the name and address off of that thing entirely. And some would say, go a step further and keep just the degrees and take away the institutions where those degrees were granted, because that is another class indicator. And we don't normally talk about that, but let's face it, folks, you're more likely to have come from a rich family if you went to an Ivy League school, way more likely, way more, yeah? So these are things that actually work. And, you know, part of the work that I do is trainings about unconscious bias. And I've done that with human resource groups. And I'll tell you, I can spend an entire half a day going through the data with folks on this stuff. And at the end of our time together, people will still say, but we're doing our best. What do we do? I go, right. So let me just be as blunt as I can. Tomorrow, go back into your office and take the names and addresses off of every resume you look at. That's what you do. Let's start there. Start there. And then develop from that point. So you may have heard that this also works with different kinds of careers where people audition rather than use a resume. For instance, the great example is symphony orchestras. This has become more the norm around the United States and Europe to have symphony orchestra applicants audition behind a screen, right? Audition where their gender cannot be seen, because there was this, you know, fabulous burning question about why are there so many men in orchestras when there are actually men and women being prepared for those roles. And what do you know? Folks listening would say, well, but the men are just better. But then when they listen without being able to see, women are being hired in much larger numbers. by the way, they had to do more than just put up a screen in live auditions, because people's feet, their footsteps could still be gendered. You could hear whether a person was male or female. So it's tricky, and the mind is like, I want this information to be able to decide this thing. Don't keep it from me. And this is literally what we are grappling with, right? Is that we have very comfortable ways of applying bias, because folks, you know, bias is not a bad thing. Let me just say that. Bias is a thing that helps us to sort out the daily world, right? Like, I definitely have a bias toward eating in a restaurant that didn't make me sick the last time I ate there and had served really good food. That is an excellent bias to hold on to the next time I want to eat out at a restaurant. So lots of times biases serve us. It's just that we have to get down into when bias doesn't serve us and pluck it out like a weed, right? Leave the flowers of bias that serve us, pluck out the ones that cause us to discriminate against others. So Emily, would you share that link that I provided earlier? I have a link for you to an article if you are interested in learning more about resume bias. This one is interesting because it's looking at the same issue from another angle, which is whitening resumes, which has become a trend, which you can understand why it would happen, that folks whiten up their resumes. They leave out language that might, so like, let's say I am a Black person named Karen Williams, and so the name is not a dead giveaway, but I might go through my resume and take out or rename some of the things that I have been involved with in the past, so that my resume does not seem like the resume of a Black woman. How tragic is this? How tragic is this, that this is what it has come to for people to get an interview? Of course, in the interview, Karen Williams might go ahead and talk about her full range of experience, but if folks are being omitted before they even have a chance to meet, then that's a real problem. And so part of whitening a resume also means, like, if you have an Asian sounding name that might be difficult to pronounce, you rename yourself. That's been happening for a long time, right? But it's a trend that's right now on the rise. So that's something you can read about if you choose. Do you have questions or comments about resume bias or what we already talked about regarding the gender pay gap?
I have a question.
Hey, Tina.
Hi. I seem to have joined at just the right time because I don't have resume bias. I have a name bias, and I walk around this world as a white woman, a white queer woman, a white gender queer woman that mostly presents as masculine, blah, 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 la, la, la. You Google my name, and it's my birth name. It's most of the hits that are going to come up that are not about me are going to be Black women.
Oh.
I've been walking around the world most of my life, you know, well, all my life with this name, but I know it's not specific resume bias. I'm so sorry, but it's a weird bias that I'm dealing with. And I'm like, well, what the hell?
So let me see if I understand. You have a name that is more often associated online when somebody Googles with Black women. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Yes,
okay.
Correct.
So,
correct.
So you basically, as a white person, are experiencing the bias that a Black woman might experience.
Theoretically.
Theoretically.
Yes.
It's a really interesting thing, right?
And yeah, because
and also makes us aware of why we need to make sure to eradicate those biases for everybody.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Like
Super interesting.
People are often surprised when they do either meet me online or meet me online but then offline, or then I do admit to or say or whatever reference that well, yeah, no, I'm white. It's amazing the responses that I get back from that. And I'm like, well, how the heck do I deal with this bias? Because it is a bias. And I appreciate how names can bias things, and changing things isn't, necessarily all that great. And I'm like, I'm not going to change my name. I love my name. But yeah, it's just weird. I mean, it's just weird.
All you can do is, work for the equality of anyone who has your name.
Right.
That's it.
They're all kind of awesome as fuck. I mean, I researched them all. I'm like, well, yeah, you're dope. Okay, you're good.
That's wonderful.
Right. But yeah, anyway, that was just my question about bias.
And Lizzie, I'm just noticing, because I can see the chat box now, that your last name Wan, some people assume you're Asian. Yeah. Any other comments or questions regarding the gender pay gap or regarding resume bias?
It's really interesting because we're all, and I have a similar experience. Like, I'm Jewish, but my name is, most people assume it's Scandinavian. Well, I don't know what most people assume, but I can pass because I have blue eyes, and I don't have particularly Semitic features, but I'm full Jew, and actually don't like it. I don't want to pass. Anyway, woe is me. It's not actually a problem in the world. It doesn't cause me any. I think it probably gives me more power than it takes away from me. But I just find it interesting that on this call, we're all talking about the ways in which we are challenged by our white privilege. We're kind of giving upside down examples.
They are upside down examples, but do you know what? The thing is, what y'all are pointing out is just how much we are, each of us, judged externally. And we become aware of this with regard to appearance, but not so much with regard to names or other indicators that we, groups we represent, like just being female or just being, so really all of these things are influencing the way that we are able to move through the world, and they're worthy of our attention, especially with regard to things like resumes, where whether or not you even get in the door depends on whether somebody thinks favorably of that piece of paper. So it's a great one to look at. I want to just prompt you also to, I'm going to ask the question, as I will every week, how might you use this kind of information in your daily lives? How might you talk about these things, or look for places that you have influence to be able to change harmful bias? And if you have something in mind already, please put it in the chat box or tell us about it. But I hope that it's something that we can think about as we move forward, because to me, that's the hopeful part, is learning how to get into conversations about this stuff. And thanks, Lizzie. I see that you took screenshots of some of those slides to share with your mom. Yeah, eye rolling when you say men are more than women. I want to point out too that the kinds of slides I use, those slides come from a interactive lecture that I used to do in person, back when that was a thing, called Gender, Race, and Money. And it's all census data, right? It's data that comes from, the Labor Bureau census data. It's not like it's radical perspective taking. It is literally just what's happening. Like, here's how the pay thing looks. But it worries me that we walk around not being able to explain or talk about the gender pay gap, right? To be able to say, here's how it came about. So Sally's interested in pushing for transparency and publishing of salaries. Good one. I appreciate that. Emily, were you going to add something?
No, I was just appreciating showing mom slides.
Yeah. Yeah, right on. We might be done for today. And like I said, please give me more topics to go forward. I believe next week I'm going to talk about a thing called adultification bias, which has a huge impact on how Black girls in particular, but also other girls of color, are being treated in schools and law enforcement. So adultification bias is a thing that I hope you'll enjoy learning about. And now I just forgot the other thing, but I tagged something. I'm keeping a running list, and I am hearing from folks about topics. So please don't be a stranger if you want to discuss a certain thing.
Thank you so much. This was really fantastic. I actually teach Introduction to Sociology at a university, so you've given me lots of great ideas of how I can frame this information around the gender wage gap.
Thanks, Jana. Where do you teach? What city are you in?
In Calgary, Alberta, Canada,
Very
at Mount
good.
Royal University. Yeah.
And feel free to invite others, and also feel free to invite students to these. I've got a couple professors that are sending classes, and we'll see if any of them ever come. I don't know yet if we had. I don't think we had students on this call, but feel free.
It's a great idea. Thank you.
All right. See you all next week.